We're going to jump into our session right now. First one of the afternoon. It's always fun to do a data talk after lunch, so we hope you hang in there. We're going to have room for a few questions at the end. My name again once is Larry Gray with the Modern Miracle Network, and with me I have a good friend of mine here, Devin Drover, and I've been following Devin's career for a couple of years. He's a very accomplished young man. You're going to meet this gentleman today, and the cool thing is this is probably not the last time you're going to see this guy. Devin is a force in the common sense movement, across Canada. So today we're going to talk about collecting data and using data to advance a cause or candidate. And one of the gentlemen that was on the panel with me earlier today, Chad Bowie, we've talked about this, how politicians are made and built, and how we could take that to other leaders in other industries like CEOs of companies and people who are presidents and on boards of not-for-profits to help build up their brands so that they can help their cause, win at their cause, or also raise cash for their cause, which is something I've been doing most of my career. So maybe we'll start there. Devin's got some slides, but I just wanted to say how honored I am to have you here. He was recruited into the Generation Screwed group of conservatives back when he was a young guy in university. He's now a lawyer based in one of the most beautiful places on the planet, St. John's, Newfoundland. And if you haven't been screeched in St. John's, you need to be screeched. So check that out. And they play AC/DC also too, yes, don't they, right? Yeah, so let's put our hands together for Mr. Devin Drover, ladies and gentlemen. So I think the clicker's over there, but I did want to ask you a question, and it's sort of, and having been in politics at both the municipal, the federal, and the provincial level, it's probably one of the things that the candidates who then become MPs or MPPs or MLAs struggle with, is how do they continue to, win? And recently, an MP who will go unnamed lost here in Alberta, and probably the reason, and I could probably say it, was because he didn't have good data. He just assumed that if he kept doing what he was doing, he would become an MP again, and he didn't. And he made a great contribution. So maybe I'll start with that, and then we can jump into your slides and go from there.
Yeah, I think the issue politicians often have in political campaigns, especially individuals who are older and kind of remember doing campaigns with your normal printed out walk lists, or then even some are still using just Excel sheets. I think people get quite intimidated by this idea of data, even though it's not, there's nothing complicated about it at all. We also often think about data has to be all of these, very well organized, 100 variables, all these things, when it's not that complicated. I always think about every person has a little black book or a notepad on their phone that they're recording things on a daily basis. My mother has one next to her landline that she uses with, she's still on the black little book with recording the birthdays and relatives' phone numbers and that kind of information. That's all data. It's not anything to be intimidated about or scared about, and I think campaigns often get frightened, especially people who've used to doing things the old way, get very worried about data and don't realize that if you don't do it, your opponents are going to do it, whether that's when it comes to candidates running local campaigns, or the alternative is when we're doing advocacy campaigns, we see it. If we're not doing it, if our friends in the oil and gas industry aren't using data to further their cause, I can sure bet that our opponents in the environmental lobby will. So we certainly need to be using data and get over that initial fear.
Fantastic. There's that little clicker for you, sir.
Perfect.
And we'll get rolling here.
Awesome. So a little bit about me. I'm not going to be as nice to myself as my introduction, but I am an Atlantic Canadian. I'm a Newfoundlander. I'm very proud of that. Would love to talk to anybody about the greatest place on earth, which is St. John's. And if anybody wants to get screeched in, feel free to send me an email afterwards. I would be love to assist you in your travels to Newfoundland. I'm also a lawyer. I apologize for that up front. but I mostly practice in the civil litigation phase. I do some work actually on privacy litigation, employment litigation, and municipal litigation, which means I sue the government a lot. And our tax dollars pay for it, so I'd rather if I didn't need to sue them to begin with. But and I'm also a campaign organizer. I do a lot of digital communications and data work, but I also do a lot of field organization across all levels of politics. I'm involved with our friends here in the Canada Strong and Proud Network on our series of pages, and I'm involved in our Atlantic outfit out there. Also, have worked quite heavily on federal and provincial and municipal campaigns, including an exciting one going on right now in Kelowna. So lots going on. Some of the things I want to talk about today, I'm going to go through basically the data, my approach to data from kind of the start of a campaign or candidate campaign or not-for-profit campaign right to the end. And of course, the lawyer in me wouldn't be here if I didn't include a bit of a few notes on privacy and legal considerations. So, defining your objective. This is the problem that a lot of campaigns struggle with when they start using data, is that they don't actually define what they're looking to do. As I aptly put it, what's the point? So if we're looking for collecting data on a campaign, things normally fall into kind of three categories. You're either looking to persuade voters, so you're persuading individuals, whether voters or in the corporate world, shareholders, things like that, when it comes to shareholder activism. You're persuading them to support or oppose a certain position. So that's kind of one track that we use data for. The other is identify. That is probably the most common one you see on local campaigns. So you're identifying individuals who share a certain position and are willing to take some sort of action. Most of the time we see that with GOTV on local campaigns. We're actually trying to identify our voters and make sure they vote, identify our supporters, make sure they fundraise, identify our supporters, make sure they volunteer, that kind of thing. And the other objective we use for data is to understand. I would like to say that as a principled conservative, we always go by what our values are. We never rely on polling or data. Of course, that would be a lie. We live in the real world in which sometimes we like to understand what our voters feel like before we take a position or decide how active we're going to be on an issue. So these are kind of the best practices when it comes to setting an objective, and pretty much everything goes from that objective. But then,
so hang on, so go back to that other slide just for a sec. So a lot of people in not-for-profits, even when I did a lot of fundraising in hospice associations and things like that, they struggle with this. Why do you think that is? How do they break down in because it seems like you made it sound really simple, but.
It's not something that should be complicated, but it does come from that desire to start using data but not understand what your objective is. And at the end of the day, you need to formulate what your ask is, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about asks later in the presentation, but it's understanding if you're looking just to gauge support for a cause, is a lot different than if you're trying to motivate an existing voter to actually go out and vote, or so on and so forth. So it really comes down to the ask, and I'm going to talk a lot about asks very shortly. And speaking of asking, which is not an intentional pun there, but asking the right questions is the other thing. So once you set an objective, you actually need to figure out what you actually need to know. And we have a desire, of course, in a perfect world, I would have, if I'm working in a campaign and you are the audience here is the constituents, I would have information on every single thing about all of you, stored in a database conveniently where I could access, everyone's opinion on every issue and build a campaign around that. Of course, we don't live in that perfect world. So it's figuring out, asking the right questions, and getting as much as you can get, but also making sure you're actually collecting what is absolutely necessary to achieve your objective. So one thing is, of course, the importance of identifiable information. And every campaign is different on what you actually need for identifiable information. For example, if you're working in a municipal campaign I'll use my hometown, the city of St. John's, you're looking for anybody, if you're signing a petition, you want to make sure that the person signing the petition or giving you data is actually located within the city of St. John's. So for that, you want to use, for example, maybe an area code, but some area codes extend outside of the boundaries, so that's no good. So you need to use the actual addresses. This is also important, for example, if you're doing a nomination race in an urban riding. St. John's has, on one side of the road, you're in one riding, one federal riding in St. John's, and then across the road, you're in another. So getting the addresses, the full address, is necessary on a campaign like that. On other campaigns, sometimes just an area code will do, or a postal code. So asking for just what you need is a lot better than asking either for too much information that people are hesitant to give you, or asking for, just asking for the postal code, for example, and then you don't even know if they're in your constituency. And Hamish talked a little bit about this in his, what I caught of his remarks about the issues with SMS. When you're sending out, do you oppose the carbon tax? And people reply that they oppose the carbon tax, but that's great. You have no information on them besides their phone number, and that creates issues. So making sure that you're actually collecting all the information you need is super important. And when you're framing what your survey or whatever your touch point is with voters, making sure that's that information you're collecting. The other thing is, depending on your objective, you're going to change how you actually ask questions. For example, if you're seeking, like I said, to understand your voters, if you're wondering about how people feel about a policy, you're probably going to frame it as a neutral question. If you're recruiting a voter who's opposed to the carbon tax, you're not going to say, do you support a price on putting a price on carbon? Yes or no? You're going to ask, do you want to end Justin Trudeau's job-killing carbon tax, right? It's a very different question. And depending on what your objective is, if you're looking to identify people who are opposed to the carbon tax, you're going to ask that question. So framing the questions around what your objective is always super important. And be aware of privacy concerns when you're doing these surveys. People don't like filling out long surveys. They don't like giving too much information. And you also have to consider the drop-off rate. And what I mean by that is if I get a phone poll and they're asking me 15 questions, I'm very enthusiastic for the first 2, but then when it comes to every breakdown, I get a little less enthusiastic, and you start to give less and less information. So if you're filling out, you need to consider how many questions you're asking, because people will get tired, will either give you less reasonable or less truthful answers, or they just won't answer at all. So only ask what you're actually looking for.
Yeah, so Devin, if I could just jump in there just quick to ask. So having recently worked on a provincial leadership campaign and also working on a federal campaign, I've noticed this. So what would be the common mistakes and then sort of, because I think a lot of people now, they know when you're calling them and you're asking them questions. Like that's why you see a higher percentage of people that are undecided, right? Like they know what you're up to, you're trying to identify them. So what are some of the common mistakes in the type of questioning? Like how can we help our volunteers, both at the not-for-profit and in campaigns, ask better questions?
I think it's getting directly to the point. People don't like to they don't like to provide questions or answers to questions that they think is unnecessary or they think is weird. And sometimes we can ask too much about a topic, or we can ask questions that aren't really getting to our objective. The normal GOTV call, we've all probably done 100 of them or thousands of them. Do you support this candidate? Yes or no. If they say no, you say thank you, have a nice day, and you hang up. That is the perfect amount of questions to ask, asking just what you need. And I think that's a problem that a lot of campaigns have, is they try to shoot for the moon and they don't get there. So, yeah, that's how I would approach that. And the next thing I'd like to talk about is actually the collection methods. So now that you know what your objective is, you know what you're looking to achieve, and you know how you're going to ask the questions. You got to figure out how you're actually going to ask them. So there's kind of 4 buckets I see of collection methods. The first is your in-person events. So that's like an event here today. This one's a bit different because we registered online, so everybody has that information. The organization hosting it has that information. You also see, your printed petitions. In New Flam, we often, our MHAs will do petitions in which we'll bring them to local gas stations. We'll stick them up with thumbtacks, and people can, if you're opposed to the carbon tax, you sign a petition, and then we eventually present it in the House. And we also have access to that data then for campaigning. That's another way in person we collect data, and the same thing with door knocking, which is the classic local candidate activity. A few caveats with collecting data this way is that, one, if it's something that you're handwriting, one, not everybody can read everybody's handwriting. I certainly have some older partners at my firm who I absolutely have to have their assistant translate it for me every day. Definitely, as much as you can, collect things on iPads, mobile apps as well. It doesn't need to be, you don't need to have a $1,000 software for collecting data, but going around with an iPad and an Excel sheet is a lot easier recording data than if you're trying to translate somebody's hand scribbles into your database after an event or after door knocking or after they sign a petition. The other thing is people will not give all the information sometimes on a form. So if you just have a form in the back of a room that anybody at this party meet and greet can sign, not everybody will sign it, and not everybody will give all the information. If they don't want to give their email, they'll often just skip the field. If you have somebody actually asking those questions, they will be more likely to fill it out. The other bucket is digital collection. So this is a lot of what I do: online petitions. You're advertising. This works great, especially if you have a large social media presence. So you're putting up a petition. Hey, sign this petition if you want to scrap the carbon tax. They click the link. They go in. They provide their information. Or you can promote that through targeted ads. You can use social media, and I'll give some examples of that shortly. Email, of course, email is great for collecting information depending on what your ask is. That also only works, though, if you have an existing email base to rely on. I know Chad talked about this earlier, I believe, in answering a question. It's hard sometimes to get going without that base of data, so it's normally better to start with in-person or digital collection to kind of build your list, and then you can use email as a way to target them afterwards. And then you have the telephone-based collection. So that's everything from your kind of robocall telephones to kind of live surveys, so the volunteer working a phone list, to the text message, reach out, which kind of what I mentioned a minute ago with what Hamish mentioned as well. There are some drawbacks to that, especially if you're just mass texting all Canadians or all Newfoundlanders or all Albertans, whatever the case may be.
So what's your favorite out of these four?
I like digital because
Yeah.
it's easy, it's cheap. Facebook ads are still relatively cheap, but I think it's really about using the right one depending on what your goals are. And also what your resources are. So for example, paying for a telephone survey is quite expensive. But if you don't have a lot of volunteers on your campaign, it's pretty effective. You're paying for something that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. A great example of this is I was the communications and policy advisor for Ches Crosby during his PC leadership race and afterwards. But that was the exciting part because we won that campaign. But we were up against basically a party that didn't want him as leader, or the establishment, so to speak, didn't want him as leader, and they had a lot more volunteers than us. What we managed to do is he had fairly high name recognition, so we robocalled the entire province of Newfoundland with a very short message from him. I'm Ches Crosby, I'm running for PC leader, I want to be premier. If you want to support my campaign, press 1. Everybody that pressed 1, we would then get their callback number, and we'd have a volunteer the next day call all of them and talk them through the signing up for membership and so on and so forth. We wouldn't have been able to call all of those Newfoundlanders and Labradorians without using the robo-polling first, because we just didn't have the volunteer capacity. But we were able to raise the funds to do it. So depending on your budget, you may want to look at something like telephone polling. If you got more technical skills or a social media presence, you may use something like the online petitions. A number of organizations do that quite well. And if you have already a large list, if you're a political party and you're asking somebody to share a new video, which Pierre Poilievre's first email out after winning the leadership was did you see my victory speech? Click here, share it with your friends and family. It's a quick ask, but he was able to send that out and be successful because the Conservative Party already has such a massive membership base. So, there's certain advantages depending on what your collection, or depending what your budget is, what your expertise is, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and you've given 2 examples there. Like in the case of Pierre, he was so popular, if you robo-dialed a Pierre person, I think they'd be okay with it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's kind of neat how you can take that too and then have a live volunteer just turn that around and identify that voter.
Yeah, I mean, there's drawbacks with it because, somebody who signs up for party leadership races, you have issues with voter turnout. So we had a lot more we had a very low voter turnout with that approach, but it did help sign up a significant number of members. And like I said, we would have never reached that many people otherwise. So it was fantastic. We won 60% or over 60% of the points, and almost all of our support were new members, and that's probably the reason why.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also do work with like not-for-profits and other groups. Have you tested some of these political things with those folks?
Yeah, I mean, on some of the campaigns we've done with the Strong and Proud Network, we've done robo-texting to collect data. I know that was particularly useful for voter ID in trying to determine what ridings we support pro-oil and gas candidates, and it certainly helped identify where our support was strong, for example, in the 2019 Newfoundland and Labrador election. And then once we found out, these are our strong areas, I was able to spend our ad budget targeting those areas, and we were able to defeat candidates that, I would have never thought we would have defeated otherwise. So I think it can be quite useful depending on your objective. If you're a not-for-profit, looking to reach, anybody about your cause, I think, those methods can work.
Mm-hmm. Cool. What else you got for us?
Well, I'm actually going to talk about some examples. So, of course, Pierre Poilievre's, everyone's either been to one of these rallies or at least seen coverage of these rallies. They were huge. We had pundits say that there is no way these people showing up to these rallies were actually going to buy memberships. Turns out they did quite a lot. And the reason so many people showed up to these, or that showed up to these events, bought memberships, is because there were volunteers at greeting everybody that was walking through the door with an iPad in hand, asking them if they've purchased the membership, or with their cell phone in hand, asking them if they've purchased their membership, if not, encouraging them to purchase their membership. And you're asking them the first thing as soon as they got there, as they were lining up, Pierre would show up, he would give his stump speech. Then afterwards, the next thing would be the photo line. So everybody would want to meet the leader. So he would line up. We'd start a line before his speech was even over. There'd be 100, 200 people in Atlantic Canada, large or more than that, waiting to meet him at some of our events out here. And as they were in line, we would then ask them again. We would go through the line, every single person, have you purchased your membership? And that's a good way in which we were able to sign up so many Canadians was through these in-person events.
And also, just add too, obviously, you had worked on the eastern part of this campaign, and I had helped on the western side of the campaign. And one of the things that I was really surprised about was how QR codes actually worked. Yeah. And HQ had come up with these QR codes, and I thought QR codes were dead and they didn't work anymore. And you could welcome a volunteer, teach them how to do it, and they were on the right there in front of you. They were making a donation or they were buying a membership.
Yeah, and the thing with in-person events too, it's you get and the benefits of those QR codes is you show up, a stranger's asking you to give them your credit card information. You've never seen me before. I've got an iPad. I'm shoving in your face, asking you for money. If that works a lot differently than if you have somebody who's scan here, you can go on your cell phone, you can do it yourself. People really appreciated that. So some people are skeptical of QR codes, but I thought that was a great way we could actually translate and make sure people on the spot got their memberships. Because that's the thing with in-person events. If somebody shows up, if they don't sign up that day, the chances of them signing up the next day is a lot lower, and the chances of them signing up the day after that is lower again. So being able to get them right away is very effective.
Yeah, and even in Kelowna, at where I'm from, the Kelowna Foundation for the hospital, they've had an event running every year, and they've used that this year, and they've raised extra $100,000. It's an event where basically all the rich people get in their fancy Ferraris and drive around, and they take kids that are needy for a ride. And I've seen that event, just using new techniques that you're talking about, go from raising a couple $100,000 to this year they raised, I think it was $1.8 million, which you just, how do you do that? And I think it's you sharing that, like controlling that moment with that iPad. You've got that donor or that person sort of right in front of you.
Absolutely. Some other examples as well I'd highlight, our online petitions. This one's from our friends at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation on scrapping the carbon tax. They have a pretty good social media presence, both individually and with all of their coordinators, so they're able to just blast something like this out, a direct link. People fill it out, and now you're on the CTF's mailing list, and that helps with their future campaigns. Same thing, another PR example. He had a big social media presence, encouraging people constantly to go to a certain website. You'd also include the text in the description. You'd include the link as well. It motivates people to actually go out and fill out a form. And of course, your text message campaign. I couldn't find an example of the last time I've done one of these, so I had to go to Twitter to find one. And this is the only one I could find was from Peter MacKay's leadership campaign. I had to crop out the reply. But yeah, it's an effective means as well to get members.
So go back for a second. Is that peer, like just to touch that peer one? I mean, the power that the younger generation is doing online is that graphic, instead of, and that's all you have to share. You don't need anything, and everybody's like, or a video, even if you had a video that just, it gets shared more.
Yeah, and it's funny, this is how not to do it. So the NDP just released an attack ad on Pierre Poilievre, and it was a pretty well done video, but at the end of it, you can click the video on Twitter to go to the NDP's website. If I was designing this, I would have had it click through where you click on it and it goes to an NDP page where you're saying, do you support, or do you want to stop Pierre Poilievre? If so, fill out this form. If you click on it, it actually just goes to a generic NDP membership form. The issue with that is you're not asking the right question, right? It's not, if you're framing something as, do you support a carbon tax, or do you hate the carbon tax? When I click on it to fill out the form, it should tell me I'm filling out a form to hate the carbon tax, not to support the aims and objectives of a political party. So it's being specific is super helpful. And I mean, all of that comes down to what I'm actually going to talk about now, which is asking the right questions and putting the data into action. So you've collected the data. What do you do with it? And there's kind of four systems. Cautious about time here, so I'm going to be pretty quick and not rely too much on this. But
you're doing okay.
We'll leave time for all the fun questions. So building a system, that is how you're going to store it. There's lots of different data apps, CRM softwares that you can use. Nation Builder is one that I've used quite a bit. Creating an ask, what you're actually going to ask the people that you've signed up to do. Targeting a message to that group of people and then analyzing the results, and if it doesn't work, do something different. But when it comes to figuring out what an ask is, there's kind of six ones I've identified. Fundraising is a big one. We saw it this morning. Once you have a list of people that support your cause, then you can email that group and ask for money, which is, at the end of the day, we all need that for our campaigns to strive. You can directly lobby them to do something. So this is, you've identified that you don't like the carbon tax. Click here to send an email to your senator or to your member of parliament or your local MHA or MLA, MPP to let them know that you want to scrap the carbon tax. Your GOTV, obviously the biggest ask we ever ask people to do is to actually go and vote. To volunteer, this one can be difficult to get people to do, but you can recruit volunteers using the data you collect to share content. I mentioned the Pierre Poilievre example, or attend events. So these are all ways that you can, send out a message to, sending out a message to your list and asking them to do one of these things. Very simple, very effective.
So even get out the vote for me, like in a not-for-profit scenario, if you're doing that big fundraising dinner,
exactly,
you've got to make sure that you have all your top donors, all your people, you get them there at all costs. You just don't do the usual send an email and hope to sell some tickets. And
Yeah.
And with really good organizers, especially in the hospice world, we did an event where we used political tactics to get people to come out. We did a Swinging with the Stars thing, right? And just creating that excitement so that the tables sold out.
Yeah, I mean, I do some work in the not-for-profit space, mostly on, as a board member and as a lawyer. And the amount of times I'm able to use what we think is traditionally political techniques on data and apply it in the not-for-profit sector, I often see a lot of success. It's really it's the same idea. And I mean, it also applies to private business. You identify what identify what your objective is, figure out how to ask the question and just ask, right? And it's so basic. This is the idea that data is some big scary thing that campaigns need to embrace, and it's not. It's just, you're just identifying your potential supporters and turning them into supporters or turning them into donors in the not-for-profit sector or getting them to show up to your events. So it's the fact it's something intimidating is really just people need to get over on campaigns and in the not-for-profit sector as well. So turning to some other examples, this is actually one that we did with the Strong and Proud network of pages to tell the Senate vote no on C11. So we sent this out to all of our supporters over email. We shared it on our Facebook pages. We did in every region of the country, and it was a simple, you fill out you put in your name and your postal code, you click send, and it sends an email to your local senator or the senators for your province. And very simple way, but to actually get them to do something directly. We were able to do that because we could utilize the data we've already collected and as well collect new data in the process of sending out the petitions. So a really good way to directly lobby somebody. The other thing is fundraising. Obviously, the Conservative Party of Canada does this quite well. People like Chad and the others on the panel this morning. You can use the data once you collect it to actually fundraise. Always super helpful. Their Conservative Party does quite well with these, and they follow that same format that Chad mentioned earlier on his slides, and I think that's a great format for anybody to follow. Then there's privacy and legal considerations.
Okay, hang on. Everybody's got to stand up for a second. Legal talk now.
Yeah, exactly.
Legal talk, or don't get up. Don't.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not gonna hammer on too much about this because I'd like to leave time for questions. But while handling data, I just want to remind everybody to make sure that you know your obligations and responsibilities under both federal and provincial statutes as well. The common law in this country is expanding more and more to protect people's privacy, so being very cautious of that, including developing policies on how you handle your data, make it readily available and accessible for people. So having those privacy policies up front with your organization, especially larger organizations that are handling a lot of data and the data is potentially being passed through a lot of hands. Very important to have policies internally to balance that out. And I think trying to think of, it's important to consider what makes a privacy policy good is to make sure that you do have strict rules on how your data is shared, if it's shared at all. Of course, general practice or best practice is don't share the data outside of your organization without the consent of the people that you've collected them from. Make sure that you're aware of who's handling it and who has access to it. So don't give, if you have a volunteer one day off the street, don't give them access to your full database. It sounds like a really simple question, but the amount of local campaigns I've been on in which people have been handing out way too much data is concerning. We all hear horror stories of Excel sheets being sent around with every voter's information on it. Avoid it. It will cost your campaign. And so I think having good policy privacy policies, that's a tongue twister for me today, having good privacy policies in place is super vital, and make them available on the website. We have on the Strong and Proud pages, we have our privacy policy out there for everyone to see.
So as an example, this was the first campaign out of 30 that I've worked on for a national candidate where I actually signed a non-disclosure document with the candidate directly, not with the campaign, but with Pierre directly.
Yep.
So, you know, we've seen past campaigns federally where the data, everybody ends up with a copy of it.
Yeah, and I mean, in the past, the Conservative Party, for example, has started cracking down on data exchange. From the 2 leaderships ago, we had an example where the data from the party was shared with another organization, and they were able to identify that because they basically insert fake names and emails that can be traced back to the party. Yeah. So, you know, people are smart enough to monitor their data, and you don't want to be caught in that situation and face a lawsuit or some kind of other action. So avoid that at all costs. But that kind of, and the other thing I'll say about privacy and legal considerations, I talked about text message campaigns as well, robopolling. There are certain rules with the CRTC when you're doing that, so I do advise contacting legal when doing something like that or ahead of doing something like that, so you don't break CRTC laws, because you don't want that investigation either.
Yeah, like even the simple thing of registering with them to make sure that you can make the phone calls. A lot of people don't even do that.
Yeah,
stuff, right?
I mean, it's the places. I mean, there's good vendors out there who handle those services, and a lot of them will guide you through the process. But you don't want to rely on somebody else at the end of the day when your organization's on the line.
So I know the answer to my last question before I turn it over to Troy, who's going to be the roaming reporter out there and get some more questions for you. What's the one thing you would recommend to somebody who's thinking of actually starting a project like this with their organization?
Build a social media presence. You know, don't rely too heavily on it because, you know, Facebook could come along one day and completely change how your page operates and your reach. Same thing with Twitter. But building a social media presence or kind of an organic presence allows you to easily engage with people and actually collect data from them. Yeah, that would be my first step if I was, you know, starting a new campaign or helping out a candidate, helping out a not-for-profit, is building a social media presence for data collection.
Yeah, but yet today we still learned that, you know, some people vote because some guy's got a purple sign, right?
Yeah, of course.
Amazing. Yeah. Troy.
Anyone with a question? Hands up, hands up. Okay, up here, I'm coming.
Troy's getting his workout today.
Yeah, God knows I need it.
Hi, I was just curious, like, are there any specific data analysis tools and programs that you would like really recommend for a not-for-profit?
So it's a great question, and I did a Bachelor of Science in Economics as my first degree, and I used a lot of all of the like data and R and all that kind of stuff, and I still end up just using Excel all the time. So maybe somebody who's more into the data analysis than I am, but I seem Excel works just fine, and it's good when talking with when sharing information with clients, for example. Everyone knows how to use Excel or knows at least how to open an Excel document, so I find Excel works just great.
Others? Okay. We answered all the questions today there was to answer.
We're too efficient.
Yeah, you're too good up there. How's our time, actually?
We got 7:41, 7:40, 7:39, 7:38.
Anything? Okay, here we go, Bruce.
I'll just ask you about you have mentioned privacy. I have had a lot of groups come to me in campaigns asking this question about privacy, and most of the time it's because somebody in the organization is too worried about privacy, and they think they can't share it with anyone, and it's an odd position for a lawyer to tell them, actually, you know, if it's your internal information, you can share it internally and you can do stuff internally, and often you find gatekeepers inside the organization get freaked out about privacy. I don't know if you've had that experience or not. It sounds like your experience has been the opposite, so I was just curious to your reaction to what I've heard.
Yeah, I mean, I think really so much of it is just if you have clear internal policies on this stuff, like for when I'm working with a not-for-profit or an advocacy group, you know, you kind of have those policies. When working with local campaigns, people can get skittish about sharing information. I think just, you know, talking them through what they can do can often ease those fears, but it is certainly a struggle with some volunteers.
Well, if we have no others, we can take a couple extra minutes for, oh, we do. Boys,
Now's your
shy
chance.
group. Now's your chance.
You
Now's
have
your
Devin Drover in the house.
I will be here all evening, so
Yeah.
Thanks. So maybe could you talk through some examples or maybe common patterns of examples of discoveries that have come out of data projects that you've used in the past or done in the past?
Yeah, I think the one thing that's always surprising to me is finding support for causes that I would have never thought areas of Canada have supported. I mean, I kind of alluded to this earlier. We won a seat provincially in the 2019 provincial election that was a staunch Liberal seat. Only went PC maybe once since Confederation. And it was all because when doing robopolling, we noticed there was a lot of area code, which could be linked to this series of communities, was heavily in favor of our messaging on carbon tax, and I forget the other key messages we ran robopolls were at the time. So I find that always as surprising. The same thing with Pierre Poilievre's leadership race. You know, we ended up with 88% in Labrador, and you know, it's always interesting to see where messages resonate, and being able to try that with a lot of data, I find it is the most useful thing. That's what I find the most enjoyable, actually, is able to look at, you know, this gun rights issue is going really well in Fredericton. So the next election, that needs to be our key issue. So it's finding out where our supporters are is, I think, the most interesting pattern that comes to mind.
What recommendations would you give? Like, it's a story, 20 years ago when I was in the IT space and that, one of the biggest fears is you do all this work and then Devin disappears. Devin's on doing something else. Like, is it insourced, outsourced? How do you protect your organization from making sure that they don't lose all of this investment?
Yeah, it's again internal policies. Having, nobody should be able to walk away with all your data. It should be stored somewhere securely that can be accessible by more than one individual. You should have policies with respect to, or a system that you can see who's exported data. I know Nation Builder, you can see a history of who's exported data, so you know if somebody is somehow exporting out a significant amount of your contacts, then you know something's up. So having, using a system that protects your data and having more than one person access it and have it stored on a cloud or something like that versus, my hard drive that I'm gonna waste coffee over tomorrow.
Okay.
True story.
Our last question here in the middle.
The Conservative Party of Canada has lost 3 elections in a row. So have the Newfoundland Progressive Conservatives. Pierre just won a huge victory in Newfoundland and Labrador, as you just mentioned. Do you think Pierre's campaign did anything that the federal Conservatives and your provincial Conservatives can learn from to win?
Yeah, I mean, Newfoundland and Labrador should 100% be a Conservative province. If I name support for oil and gas, gun rights, skepticism of the federal government, you wouldn't know if I'm talking about Alberta or Newfoundland and Labrador. But what Pierre did differently is he actually showed up. So Pierre did 3 stops in Newfoundland and Labrador. We didn't need to do the second trip there because his support numbers are already very high. I think the Conservative pathway to winning in Atlantic Canada and Newfoundland and Labrador is actually showing up, staying on message, so not trying to talk about the same things or different things in the East Coast as you do the West. You talk about the same issues, you stick to your principles, and you identify supporters. Pierre managed to talk about issues that Newfoundlanders and Labradorians care about. He does it in question period every day. He just talked about the impact of the carbon tax on seniors in his question period, I believe, yesterday. Talking about those issues is vital, if the Conservative Party wants to do well in Atlantic Canada, I think they need to actually show up and talk the same language and spend more efforts in identifying votes. When it comes to the provincial party, they're useless because they're afraid to take a stance on anything, and which Pierre wasn't afraid to take a stance on. He took a stance on everything. He's very clear on what he stands for. The PC party, I'm convinced in Newfoundland and Labrador right now doesn't want to form government because I have no idea what they stand for, and I'm somebody who's fairly in the loop. So if they want to do well again, they will define a clear message that's based on Conservative principles and identify voters based on that and not offer a liberal light equivalency.
Right on. So thank you for being with us today, Devin. I don't think we've seen the last of Devin. I like talking about this data stuff because I do know how important it is, so I appreciate you, and I appreciate you, audience, for paying attention this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.